Now that we understand the file hierarchy, let's explore two very specific files in greater detail. These are perhaps the two most important files we as developers need to master, as generally speaking, Android Studio takes care of the rest of the work for us. There's only minor modifications otherwise. So these are going to be our main activity.kt and our activity_main.xml files. If you're not using Kotlin, by the way, this will typically be main activity.java and will look very slightly different. The syntax is different, but the functionality is all exactly the same. I must note from here on out, I will be using Kotlin specifically rather than Java files, so I would recommend that you make the change. I find Kotlin's just a bit easier to use, and this entire tutorial is about Kotlin anyway. So, what exactly are these two files used for? By the way, main activity is in this package here, and activity_main is in our layout in resources. Okay, so we've already seen briefly that our activity_main is kind of a layout file. So this means it's a way to represent either an entire screen or an entire page in our application, or at least part of it. So we can specify just, for example, let's say we wanted just a small fragment of the screen to be like a pop-up window or something. Well, we can create a layout file just for that. It might not be as big as a whole screen, but it works exactly the same. Maybe this pop-up window has, let's say, some kind of a title, has maybe a text box, and then a button. Well, we would just add the elements here, and then when needs be, we would call upon this layout file and display it using what's called a layout inflator, but I'm not going to get too into detail when it comes to layout inflators. Just know that we can kind of display these layouts by using something like that, okay? Generally speaking, all of the layout files go in here or in subdirectories of our layout files, and the default screen for each page in our application is typically attached to an activity. The activity is used to display that particular screen that's in our onCreate, and also it's used to manipulate the behavior that comes with that particular phone screen. So in this case, you can see that we are setting content view to r.layout.activity_main. So this is just specifying that this is the layout file we're going to use. If we had a different layout file, let's call this activity2, then we would specify that in r.layout.activity2 if that's the one we wanted to display instead. Now, this also, like I said, controls and manipulates the behavior that this activity_main would contain. So let's say I had a button here. In fact, let's just go to design and let's just drag and drop in a button for demonstration purposes. So what are we looking for? Let's grab this button here and we're just going to drag and drop it in. We can modify some text. Let's just say press me or something. Okay, and then we can kind of specify stuff like the background color. Oops, not letting me scroll. Can specify the text attributes themselves. Maybe we want to make it bigger. We want bold text or something. The positioning attributes I actually find you can modify up here, but I find that they're a little easier to manipulate through the text. Also note that this button is also added to my text file as well, because this text file specifies everything that appears on the screen and vice versa. So at some point, this is a button. It is used to press and trigger some kind of an event. Generally speaking, we'll want to attach this event to main activity because this is again the activity file associated with this layout. And then generally speaking, we'd implement some kind of a method or attach an on-click listener that would be triggered and would execute or run some code when the user presses that button. So basically any behaviors, any attributes, all of that stuff that are associated with a screen, with a particular page within the application, usually is attached to an activity file. In this case, it's just main activity and activity main, and we should be naming the layout and activities in such a way that it's easy to associate one with the other. So just to quickly recap, activity_main used to specify the layout, build up our pages, and then main activity is used to associate any behavior or any attributes with that particular layout file. So let's actually run through a really quick example of this kind of behavior relationship. In our activity_main, we have this button, but I don't necessarily like exactly where it is, and I might want to specify or modify some other attributes. So what I'd want is to have my label here or my text view and my button be kind of equal distance apart, and I want to relatively center them in the screen. So the text view would probably end up around here, and the button's going to end up down here. Well, it's very easily done with our constraint layout. If you're using a different kind of layout, I would recommend, highly recommend, that you change to a constraint layout at some point. Again, you'll probably need to add the support for that if you don't have that already. In my case, it is just this line here that gives me access to the constraint layout. Okay. Also, every time you modify the Gradle script, you have to rebuild it, but that should just take a few seconds. If there are any errors, it lets you know immediately. Okay, so I'm going to need to add some constraints to this because I'm using my constraint layout. So actually, I'm going to copy this whole constraint set. Okay, and I'm actually just going to get rid of all of this here, and I'm just going to paste it right in. So there's a few things to note here. First of all, let's run through all of the attributes for these. So this is my text view. I did not modify this in any way. A default layout file typically comes with a default text view. So there's attributes such as my layout width and height. These are fairly straightforward exactly what these are doing. Wrap content means that the width and the height are just wrapped around, in this case, the text or the content of this. If my content grows, so let's say my text says something more than hello world, says hello world, how are you doing today or something, then my width and height are going to wrap around that text and change to kind of reflect that. The text is just specifying what text this is displaying, and these constraints are just kind of constraining the position of the item. So as long as these four attributes are balanced, this will appear in the middle of the parent, okay, because we specified the width and height to wrap the content, so it hugs this, and then it's going to space out evenly within the parent because we've specified all of these attributes in such a way that would do that. For someone who's just starting out, constraint layout can be a little tricky and a little bit frustrating because you don't specify absolute positions as much. I mean, you can, but generally speaking, we try not to. Everything is positioned relative to something else. Okay, so that could be a little difficult to grasp and a little difficult to work with at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's a much more powerful layout design and is very responsive to different screen sizes and orientations. That's why I personally like to use it, because if we use just a linear layout rather than a constraint layout, then we would have to give a specific resize every single time the size of the screen changed. Okay, so this is just better this way. So in my button, I have the usual width and height and these constraints. I don't have a text yet, but that's fine. I'll set that in a little bit. But note I also have this ID. So each element that we add to our project, text view, button, doesn't matter what UI element we're adding, typically has an ID associated with it. And that ID should be unique to that element, which means that this ID is button. I can't then set my text view's ID to button as well. This is immediately giving me errors. As well, the ID should be indicative of what this is. So in this case, I might want to call this my text view. And I might want to, actually button is fine. Now, so because we've specified my button to be constrained to my parent, so center of the screen, what do you think is going to happen to these two? Well, let's take a look at the design. And now we get these two jammed right into the middle, one on top of the other. So everything is built sequentially. This item will be placed first, and then this item will be placed second, and so on and so forth. So this is the one that appears on top. However, this is no good to us, and is still not exactly what we wanted. Remember, we want the text view here, and the button here. So what we need to do is constrain these not just relative to the parent, but relative to each other. So I do want to center both items, so I'm going to keep the left and right attributes the same, but I'm going to glue the bottom of this text view to the top of this guy, and then the top of this guy to the bottom of this guy. And I can do that just by changing my constraints a little bit. So I might have the top of my button be constrained to the bottom of this guy here, which is just going to require the ID. Okay, but I do also want to glue the bottom to the bottom of the parent. Similarly, I'm going to have to change the bottom of this guy glued to the top of this button here. Just copy and paste the ID, and that should give us the spacing we want. So that looks a little better, evenly spaced here and here. Okay, so we get fully even spacing throughout, and this is called chaining, by the way. Also, if we want to view this on a different device, typically I build for the Pixel because I personally have a Pixel phone. I could change the device just by selecting from this list here. We do want to use usually the same API level, because if we don't, then sometimes we don't gain access to the elements that we'll want to be designing with. So I do want to modify this a little bit. This text is a little hard to read, so let's increase the text size. So we can just specify text size. Generally, it goes by a number followed by SP. So let's say 25 SP will be quite a big text. So as you can see, much bigger. Let's say we want to specify the style. Let's make it bold. We can say text style is equal to bold. And now that bolds the text there. So this button doesn't have any text. But rather than setting the text here, such as, I don't know, some garbage string, note how it's kind of got this orangish yellow brown, I don't even know what color that is, background to it, and it says that we should use a string resource instead. So this goes back to exactly what I was talking about in the previous section, where we're hard coding strings that can't change. We want to use a string resource. So let's open up our string resources now, strings, and we're going to create a new string called button text. Okay, and this is just going to say press me. So we have this button text. Why don't we create another text for our text view? In fact, why don't we just have it display our app name? Why even bother with anything else? So I'm just going to change this to intro to Android without the underscores. We're going to go back here. And now instead of our text saying hello world, I'd like to move it down here and specify my text equal to a string resource, so @string /, and then I want my app name here. Similarly, I'll want my @string / and then button text down here. So let's take a look at that. Looks pretty good. If my text here was a little longer, press me and then, some garbage after it, then I switch back here. As you can see, the button has grown because its layout width is to wrap content, so it'll just try to wrap around the entire content that it contains. I don't really actually want all of that, so I'm just going to get rid of it and back to here. So as you can see, there are two main ways in which we can build up our layouts. One is by specifying the code through XML, and again, if we want to add new elements, you simply open up the angular bracket, specify the element you want, let's say an edit text, which is a way to enter text that allows a user to edit it. Okay, then we typically have to specify width and height. That's all we need to specify, but we should specify other stuff, and then it just adds it to the design. So it's just added it up there. So that's one way to do it. There's also the way using the interface builder. So you actually don't have to specify any of the text. You can work entirely in your interface builder if you want. I personally like doing things through text rather than through the interface builder. And I'm not really sure why I've become accustomed to doing it that way, but I just like it a little better, so I don't usually use my interface builder too much. I usually just use this to fine-tune things and to check to see how things are looking, but then I specify most of my code through the text. However, if you do want to add in elements, it's again just as simple as dragging and dropping them in, and then you can modify some of the attributes here, or you should be able to get the full attribute list, I think, by clicking on this guy here. So you get all of the attributes that you can modify there. So now that we have a very, very simple layout, something that we can actually interact with in the form of this button, something that the user can do, let's now turn to adding this interactivity into main activity. So there's two things we can do. Well, there's two elements that we have, rather. So we can connect our text view and we can connect our button. Now we're actually not going to connect the button as a variable. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. All I'm going to do is attach its method, which will be called an onClick. So we'll want a text view. We'll just want the variable that will represent this text view itself, and then we'll want the onClick method for this button, but I'm not going to create a variable to access this button. So we're going to go to main activity, assuming that you gave these guys both IDs. We'll head back to main activity. And up here, typically I create them as global variables. We're going to create a text view so that we can access this text view here. So I'm going to start writing text view. Let's just call this text view because I'm boring like that. Okay. And this is going to need, oh right, yeah, we're working with Kotlin, so we're actually going to say val variable text view of type text view. Okay, so this is going to require a late initialization. So we're just going to say late init here, variable so that we can specify that later. So we're just going to click on this. I'm going to hold Alt, Option, and Enter. And as you can see, it's added this text view import. So text view isn't part of the native library, it's part of the Android widget library, so we have to import it just like any other UI elements. If we wanted that button, we would have to specify, or we'd have to add the import first and then the variable. So now what we're going to do here is we're going to take our text view and we're going to initialize it. We're going to set it equal to a call to this method, find view by ID, and we'll just pass in r.id and then the ID of that text view. So in our case, it was just called text view. And now we have access to everything through all of this text view's properties. So at this point, I know I kind of went through that a little quickly. At this point, this text view, because we're going to set it equal to find view by ID, r.id.textView, this is now pointing to this text view. So what this means is that any modifications we make to this variable, for example, if we set the text view.setText, or we could just call on text equals some string here, whoops, put that outside of the quotes, some like garbage string. Now the text will be equal to this when it runs. Okay. Similarly, we can change any attribute we want, background color. If we want to change its size, we can do that, and so on and so forth. We basically use this variable to access this text view's attributes. Okay, so they're pointing to the same object here. In our case, we don't want to do that with the button. What we'll want is a method that is triggered when that button is pressed. For that, we're going to create a void method. So this is going to be a function. Let's call this press button action. Okay, it's going to take in a view of type view. And let's import that as well. So again, Alt, Option, and Enter will add the import for view up here. And then we're going to take this, we're going to go back to activity main. We're going to specify an onClick method. And then we're just going to say it's equal to our press button action. So let's head on back to main activity. Now basically this function will be triggered every time the user presses that button. So let's say this was just to print hello or something. Then every time the user presses this button, it's going to print out hello. And this view that's being passed in as the parameter is the button itself. So every UI element is considered some kind of a view. In this case, this is just the view that is being interacted with, in this case, just the button. Okay, so just to quickly recap here, actually I know this section is running pretty long, so I'm going to wrap things up. And we'll explore this concept in further detail in not the next section because we need to set up a simulator, but the next section after that. So basically, we know our main activity is basically the activity file that is associated with a particular layout file. So the layout files we know are just used to specify how a phone screen is going to look or behave, and it could be an entire screen or just a part of a screen. Main activity is kind of the code that manages. We can think about it as being the code that manages that screen or that piece of layout. Okay, so within main activity, we have connected our text view and our buttons on click to main activity here through this variable text view and through this function press button action. So this just points to that text view and is a way to access and modify the attributes or properties of that text view. And then this is just going to be triggered or executed every time the user presses on that button. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to think that over. What I would strongly encourage you to do is test out some different layouts. So maybe try building your own stuff, adding different elements, explore these elements in greater detail. There's a ton of really cool widgets there. So do check those out. Maybe play around with laying them out, specifying some different attributes, maybe even connecting variables to main activity to represent them as if you were actually going to build an app. Just remember to associate an ID with each of them. And once you're done and ready to move on, I'm going to show you how to set up an emulator so that we can actually run this application. Once we've set up the emulator and can run the application, then I'll show you exactly how to use this variable and this function here.